Good morning, church. So glad to be able to talk to you this morning about God's Word again. And I am super excited to let you know that tomorrow, which will be Wednesday by us, we are driving through to Johannesburg, where we're going to do our medical examination. That's going to take place on Thursday morning. They're just going to check that we don't bring any diseases that Americans don't want into the country, do some chest x-rays to make sure we don't have TB, and they're going to check our vaccine status, and they're going to make sure that we are who we say who we are. And so we've taken some photos today, and so this is part of the process that we've got to go through before we have our interview on the 8th of June, for those of you who are not aware of it. And we suspect that if everything goes well on the interview, which should be going well, then we will be able to be in the States within a few weeks after that, maybe even a week or two, depending on when we get our passports, and obviously depending on how expensive the flight tickets are. We are super excited about that. We received some good news. We handed in our police clearance certificates on Friday, and we weren't sure if we we're going to get an expedited request. We had a letter from the church that sort of just tried to push that along, and we had good news on Monday. We received an SMS that a text message that said that our applications have been submitted, and the guy who's doing it for us, he says that we should have it then by Friday or by Monday, and we hope that is the case. We honestly hope that's the case. Then nothing is outstanding for our interview, and the interview can just go smoothly, and we can get this process done so we can get over there and finally be in your presence and get to connect with you on a different level, and no longer be visitors, but be fellow servants with you in God's kingdom. I hope that you were at church last week Sunday. If you were not, it's okay. I'll forgive you this time, but go listen to that lesson again. That was an introduction to the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel is a phenomenal book. And I'm just going to recap quickly what I said there, because obviously this lesson is aired on a Sunday morning, and many people on Sunday morning don't necessarily go to the evening service. And so let me just recap that quickly. But Daniel lived about the same time as Master Kong. Master Kong lived in the east towards China, and he is the guy that we know today of as Confucius. And Daniel surpassed Confucius. They lived at the same time, but Daniel surpassed him tremendously. Although Confucianism is even a religion still up to today, you can clearly see why Daniel surpasses Confucius. It's because Daniel just had God in him. He could predict the future, number one. Number two, he could know and interpret dreams. Not only could he interpret your dream when you tell him what your dream was, but he could even tell you what your dream was without you telling him that. And so that's only something that can come from God. And so Daniel was phenomenal. He was led by God. God was in him. And I thought it's important to study this book, because it's hard to live faithfully in a pagan world. It's hard to survive alone as a servant of God in a world where people don't respect your God. And I thought it's relevant for us in our time. And so we want to look at this book, and we want to ask the question, but how did Daniel, how did he survive in the Babylonian kingdom? That was a pagan kingdom. They worshipped other gods, as you will hear this morning. How did he manage to be so successful in that pagan world? And so I spoke about the book of Daniel, that it's basically 12 chapters. It's the first 6 chapters is a bunch of stories and tales, like Daniel thrown into the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego thrown into the fire pit. And then the last chapters, they deal with visions and dreams. I believe the book is relevant to all times. It was relevant to the Syrian kings in 160 BC. It was relevant during the time of the Roman Empire when they destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70. And the story is relevant as well for our time and for the time upon which Christ will return to judge the world. The book predicts the rise and the fall of kingdoms before they happened. That is extremely powerful. The book predicted that Greece would rule, and then the Romans, and then there would come a kingdom that is unbreakable, and that is a reference to the church. Daniel chapter 4 verse 7 is in action throughout the whole book. The text says the decision is announced by messengers. The holy ones declare the verdict, so that the living may know that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets over them the lowliest of people. That's the beautiful thing about the book of Daniel. You see this lowly servant become third highest in all the kingdom of Babylonia. He's the friend of kings right throughout the book. What are some of the lessons that I extrapolated from that is the following. First of all, you don't have to conform to the world to be successful in the world. You really don't have to. Secondly, if biblical past is true, then biblical future can be trusted. In other words, if what Daniel predicted is true and it really happened, then we can trust whatever else Daniel says, and we can trust whatever else the Bible says. Thirdly, the world can change everything around you, but nothing inside you. When you change your heart, it's your decision. The world didn't force you to do that. Daniel was forced to change his language. He was forced to change even his food, and even his language. Yeah, sorry, I did say language, right? But he never changed his faithfulness to God. And Daniel fourthly teaches us that we are temples. Daniel literally brought the God of heaven and earth into Babylon because God indwelled him. Now, without further ado, let's read the text. If you've got your Bible with you, please don't hesitate to open it and read it with me. Daniel chapter 1. We have about 21 verses, not too much. Let's read it together. Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. My heading says, Daniel's training in Babylon. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names: to Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. And so the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, so they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom, and Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. That's the text. The lesson for this morning and then for tonight is taken from this chapter, Daniel chapter 1. Let me sketch to you sort of the context of this chapter. A war has been going on between East and West. similar to what's happening today, right? Between Egypt and Babylon. And Israel was in the middle of it all. Both kingdoms were actually fighting for that piece of land, the land that belonged to God and his people. You see, because Israel is a strategic piece of land. All the major trade routes go through this area of Mesopotamia. And so Israel is an extremely valuable piece of land during this time. The great kingdoms of the world wanted rulership over this land. Now we read in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, from verse 2 to 7, the following. Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 3 months. The king of Egypt dethroned him in Jerusalem and imposed on Judah a levy of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. The king of Egypt made Eliakim, a brother of Jehoahaz, king over Judah and Jerusalem, and changed Eliakim's name to Jehoiakim. Does that sound familiar? But Necho took Eliakim's brother Jehoahaz and carried him off to Egypt. Verse 5. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he became king, and reigned in Jerusalem 11 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord his God. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, attacked him and bound him with bronze shackles to take him to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also took to Babylon articles from the temple of the Lord and put them in his temple there. Now this text shows us that Egypt made Jehoiakim king of Judah. Now what does that mean? In other words, it means he was an illegitimate king. He didn't come from the royal bloodline of David, and he didn't become king because the people wanted him there. The pagans placed him on the throne to be an instrument for them. Now, history seems to say that in his 3rd year as king in Babylon, when Babylon conquered Egypt, they kept Jehoiakim as king, but only later at the second invasion took him to Babylon. So Jehoiakim was the worst king that Judah had ever had. And so what we saw now in Daniel chapter 1 is what Nebuchadnezzar did when he took over Jerusalem while Jehoiakim was the king there. He took articles from the temple, and he took young men from the royal line of King David. And he took these guys back to Babylon. And Daniel was one of those guys. In Babylon, these young men, they go through a process of induction. Well, what does that mean, to be inducted? These are Jewish young men whom Nebuchadnezzar wants to become Babylonian young men. In the text for today, as we just read it, we see how Babylon tries to do this. Babylon tries to induct them into Babylonian life and culture. So I kept reading and reading this text, trying to make sense of what is going on. And a few questions came up in my mind. Why did they have to study Babylonian literature and language? Why were the young men from the royalty of Judah chosen first? Why were they given new names? And why was Ashpenaz given this task of overseeing them? And why is food such a big problem for Daniel? I believe that we see evidence in this text that Daniel and his friends were being indoctrinated into Babylonian life and culture. Their induction was in actual fact an indoctrination. Their induction was in actual fact an indoctrination. Now, what's the evidence of this? Well, there's a few things. When you look at chapter 1, verse 4b, the text says he was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. You see, Daniel and his friends, they were young. Every time the words young men appear in the text, and you go look it up in the King James Version, the King James Version translates it as children. They were children. These were young guys. They weren't 21. They were more like 13 to 16. Now, B.F. Skinner, the great psychologist, said, "Give me a child and I will shape him into anything." Give me a child and I'll shape him into anything. And it seems like the king of Babylon already understood this, like 2,500 years ago. You see, the king of Babylon knew these royal boys had some form of loyalty towards Jerusalem, Judaism, the old way of life, to Israel, to the culture of the Jews, to their past. And he wanted to rid them of it. So he gets them re-educated. He feeds them propaganda. He feeds them information. He gives them the history of the Babylonians from their perspective, with the goal of getting them to be Babylonians, to be loyal to Babylon instead of Jerusalem. This is indoctrination. It's not education, but more on that later. There's another form of evidence that we see in the text, and that's found in verse 7. The text says the chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. Now, quick question. Why would you change someone's name in this context? A change in name signifies a change in identity, doesn't it? A change in life, a change in allegiance, a change in goals, and even a change in religion to some extent. Nebuchadnezzar was thinking, I will change their worldview and their politics and their identity, and I'll change their religion. I'll indoctrinate them. A new name means the past you is done now. Can you imagine what it must feel like for someone to change the name that has been given to them by their parents? And Daniel's parents probably were dead now already. When people get married, the lady would change her name, like a surname, right? But that is a willful change in name that signifies a new direction in family relationships. But the change of names here in this text wasn't voluntarily. This came from the Babylonians. It was by force, to enforce a change in identity. And I find it quite interesting. One of the scholars say that there's religious significance with the change of names. You see, Daniel means Yahweh has judged. Hananiah means Yahweh is gracious. Mishael means who belongs to Yahweh. And Azariah means Yahweh helps. You see, all four of these gentlemen's names, all four of them were given by their parents with deep Jewish and religious roots. But now the Babylonians came and they sort of changed their names. And with a few slight spelling changes here and there, it seems like this is possibly why the names were changed. Belteshazzar means Bel protect him. That's the key god of the Babylonians. Shadrach is Marduk. If you change the spelling a bit, Marduk is one of the key Babylonian gods. Meshach, Aku, a Babylonian god. And Abednego is Nebu, also a Babylonian god. And so it's very probable that that is what was going on here. They were given new names that would glorify their god, the Babylonian god. And so this was an attempt to indoctrinate and strip them of their previous faith. There's also another interesting thing in verse 5. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. Now, I don't believe Nebuchadnezzar wanted to attack the religious food laws of these men with the giving of food from his table. But I do believe it possibly felt like that for Daniel and his men. And I do believe that there was another individual involved. Satan was behind the scenes orchestrating this, putting Daniel in this difficult position. To Daniel, this was an attack from Satan. It was a direct attack on his religious convictions. And so the giving of food is also a form of indoctrination and pushing them away from their religious faith. What about verse 3a? And the king spoke to Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs. And to be honest with you, when I read this and studied this, it was a little bit disturbing for me. Most English translations don't spell this out clearly, what's going on in this verse. Ashpenaz was the master of eunuchs. Let that sink in. He was the man responsible for taking care of the eunuchs, those who have been castrated so that they could serve in the king's presence. You see, castration was often performed to ensure a king's advisors did not have children or romantic interests that might tempt them towards betrayal. This procedure was intended to make the subjects asexual, disinterested in sex, lacking sexual urges, and unable to produce children. And we know that men were made eunuchs in order to be devoid of sexual desire, in order to be fully dedicated to the king's service. I also suspect that this was done so that the servants could stay away from the king's wives. Remember Potiphar's wife and Joseph? You remember what happened over there? I mean, so the castration of men who work in the temple of the king, or the palace, sorry, of the king, it had definitely a good reason. And so perhaps this was a wise way to ensure that the people who work around in your palace, that they are asexual. Now, here's the shocker. It is possible that Daniel and his friends became eunuchs, that they were castrated. This is not a fact that I'll hang my life on, but it's very likely. The text doesn't give us that information, but it's highly likely, and I'll give you 3 reasons why. Number 1, Daniel never married. He grew old in Babylon, but he never married. One of the key reasons why that might be is because he was castrated. Secondly, Daniel was a servant in a palace at a time where servants were eunuchs. All right? So it's not far-fetched to assume this. Even the man that is overseeing him is in charge of all the eunuchs. So the man in charge of him is in charge of eunuchs. You can easily deduce from that it's possible that Daniel was also then a eunuch. And then thirdly, this also falls in line with prophecy. It falls in line with prophecy. 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 17 to 18 is where God condemns Hezekiah for showing the king of Babylon the articles of silver and gold that was in the temple. And listen to the punishment that God speaks here. He says, the time will surely come when everything in your palace and all that your predecessors have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Now that we saw happened in Daniel chapter 1. We see that at the end of 2 Chronicles. Then the text says, nothing will be left, says the Lord. And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. And so we see here that God had predicted this would happen. So it's very possible. So let me summarize all of this. If all of this is true, these clues in the text are correct. If it's correct, and we make the correct observations, then Daniel and his men were brought into Nebuchadnezzar's presence to be converted to Babylonian culture and religion. They came into the palace under strict motivation to be stripped of their past. The names their parents gave them were stripped away. Their family ties were thus ripped away from them. Their Jewish food laws were stripped off them. And if it is true, even their sexuality was taken from them. It's as if the Babylonian mindset is this: subdue, indoctrinate, convert. Let them become like us. Welcome to Babylon, guys. Here we take everything away from you and make you be who we want you to be. Now allow me to share some thoughts. Daniel submitted to everything except the rejection of God's will. Change my name? Fine. Teach me your language? Fine. Teach me your history? Fine. Remove my genitals? Not fine, but okay if that happened. Force me to disobey God? No, that is not fine. I will give up my name, I'll give up my culture, my language, even my sexuality if I have to, but I will not deny my God. I will not disobey Him. I will not neglect or reject His law. I will go through my whole life in a pagan world, but I will never give up my God. Now that is serious devotion. Daniel and his friends proved to the king of Babylon that he had it wrong. That you can't cookie cut people. In other words, you can't change their physical appearance, their language. Well, you can change their physical appearance and their language, but you cannot make them Babylonians worshipping the Babylonian God. You can make people loyal to your kingdom, to your language, to your sciences, to your politics, but you cannot make them worship your God. You cannot force change on the outside and you can force change on the outside and still fail at changing the inside. You know, sometimes we are so upset with politics, with what the kings of the world impose on us that we go on as if we are robbed of eternal life. It doesn't matter which political party is in control. It doesn't matter which bills are passed. Nobody and nothing can rob you of your devotion to God. You think you live in a bad country with a bad government? Can you still speak your language? Do you still have your birth name? Do you still worship God freely now? We have nothing on Daniel and his friends. We say times are getting bad. Ladies and gentlemen, we haven't seen bad times. Imagine we put ourselves in Daniel's shoes. We get ripped out of sweet home. You get ripped out of sweet home. You get taken to China by the Chinese or the Vietnamese, or choose the worst nation for you imaginable, the Russians, whoever. You get forced to learn their language, to learn their culture, to eat their food. They change your name. And they take away your sexuality and make you a slave for life. Can you imagine what that feels like? That's when our true faith in God is tested, and Daniel passed the test. Yes, we find ourselves in Babylon today. The culture of our time is woke. The culture of our time is forcing its belief systems on us, its morality, and it's forcing its sexuality, its deprived sexuality on us. Social media is indoctrinating the minds of the young. But children who put God first and decide to honor God will not be led astray. So we need to invest in children. It is worrying when the children disappear from the churches. We need to pray about it, and we need to put some proactive work into it. Daniel submitted to everything imposed on him, but he resisted on anything that would be dishonorable to his God. And his recipe paid off. The last verse of chapter 1 says that Daniel remained with the king until the reign of Cyrus. You see, Daniel and his friends were 10 times more impressive than the other young men. Why was Daniel so successful? How could he deny his whole identity and be fine with that, and refuse to dishonor God through a simple meal? It would be easier for me to change my diet than to have to accept and study the teachings of a nation that killed my parents and took my city, forced a new name on me, and stripped me of my sexuality. Daniel was fine with it because he had resolved that his life belonged to God. His goal in life was not to have his own way. His goal in life was to glorify God, and so he did. I was so reminded when I read this, I was reminded of what Paul writes to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 20 to 21. In a large house there are articles not only of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay. Some are for special purposes and some for common use. Those who cleanse themselves from the latter will be instruments for special purposes, made holy, useful to the master, and prepared to do any good work. I ask the question, how does this text fit in with Daniel? You see, we're all articles in God's house. And how you cleanse yourself and prepare yourself determines how noble of a task God will pick for you. Indeed, Daniel was a noble man. That's why God used him for such a powerful, noble purpose, as we will see throughout the book. Nebuchadnezzar transferred items from Yahweh's temple to the temple of his God. He took the sons of kings from their father's palace to his palace. But he underestimated the quality of the young men that he took from Jerusalem. He didn't know that he was bringing vessels of the true God of heaven and earth into his palace. And because Daniel cleansed himself, as Paul says, God used him so powerfully in the lives of 4 great kings. Ladies and gentlemen, when you get stripped of everything that is valuable to you, it is easy to move into despair. Like Denzel Washington once said in a movie, I think it's Equalizer, pain will either hurt you or alter you. When you get stripped of what is valuable to you, do you just suffer and move into depression, or does it alter your attitude? Does it bring you closer to God or push you away from Him? You see, Daniel moved closer to God. The deeper he went into the trial, the deeper his relationship with God grew. We are tempted to move away from God when we hurt, but moving closer to God is the actual thing that heals us. let's conclude. Tonight we'll finish the rest of chapter 1. 2 things from my side. It seems like when we read Daniel, it seems like you can conform to culture without conforming to its God. You can conform to culture without conforming to its God. Daniel could speak like a Babylonian, understand the history and politics of the Babylonians. He had a Babylonian name. On the outside, he looked like a Babylonian, but he was a Jew. He worshipped the God of heaven. It's not your culture that defines you or your education. It is the God whom you serve with your whole heart that defines you. That's one thing I pick up. And secondly, be careful of indoctrination while you seek an education. These are 2 different things. I like to listen to some of the talks of Kent Hovind. And he always points out, when he speaks about evolution versus creation, he points out that in schools today, kids are not being taught creationism, they are taught evolution. They're just taught evolution. But if you look at the facts in nature, the facts of nature can be interpreted in 2 ways. It can support evolution, but it can also support creationism. And so he says what should be happening in school is we should be teaching kids both sides, both possibilities. That is education. It's teaching both sides. Indoctrination is giving just one side. And that's what's happening in the schools around the world. They're being indoctrinated with evolution. All the facts are the same. And a lot of it is based on faith. I think that is important to take note of today. If someone is to be educated, they must look at both sides of the pendulum. And I say this with respect. Be careful of YouTube. Be careful to base your understanding of things on YouTube videos. It is easy to find on YouTube any video that supports what you already believe. Go look at the YouTube videos that says the opposite. If you want to educate yourself, always look at both sides of the coin. Don't base your confidence on a video that you see here or there on YouTube. When you do your research, look at both sides. When you study the Bible and you have an opinion about something, go look at the opposite side of your opinion. That's how you educate yourself. Otherwise, you just indoctrinate yourself. I pray that something said today was a blessing to you. And I'm looking forward to seeing you tonight. Have a wonderful afternoon. Love you guys. Bye.